Okay, so now I have the distinct honor to introduce our presidential address, which is titled "To Catch a Light-Filled Vision, American Studies and the Activation of Radical Traditions." And it's a really proud time to be a member of the ASA, where we can say, our president will not praise white supremacists or Nazis. But he offers us, of course, so much more. Bar's been set pretty low for leadership these days. Roderick Ferguson is professor in the Department of African American Studies and the Gender and Women's Studies program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is the co-director of the Racialized Body Research Cluster at UIC. He is the co-editor with Grace Hong of the anthology Strange Affinities, The Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization, 2011. It's a long list, so bear with me. He is also co-editor, along with Eric Edwards and Jeffrey Ogbar, of Keywords of African American Studies, forthcoming in 2018 with NYU Press. It's out now, okay, good. In addition, he is the author of One-Dimensional Queer, 2018 from Polity Press. Also, We Demand, the University and Student Protest 2017. The Reorder of Things, the University and its Pedagogies of Minority Difference 2012. And Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer of Color Critique, 2004. He has written articles on race, social theory, cultural formations, sexuality, and feminism. And he, at this pivotal moment in history, is providing us with the exact model of leadership we need for these times. Please welcome the American Studies Association President, Roderick Ferguson.
We are gathered on land first inhabited by the Cherokees and the Muskogee Creeks. We pay respect to elders past and present, and to the ancestors who labored for us and who watch over us. Ashe. It's nice to see you guys. Appreciate it. I bring you greetings from Barbara Ransby down the street. Yes, she sends this message to us, quote, "The 2018 ASA program is exciting, provocative, and generative. Please know that we have been inspired by your theme of emergence in parallel time under the rubric of Just Imagine, Imagining Justice. We will be discussing, debating, and wrestling with some of the very same issues as you. Daily news headlines remind us that we live in dire and unstable times, replete with danger and ripe with possibilities. Let's accept the challenge and do the work. We all have an important role to play in imagining and fighting for a truly feminist future," end quote. Thank you, Scott, for that introduction. My longstanding love and thanks to my friend of, 17 years, Leanne Howe, for her writing and saying yes to being our artist in residence. I would like to thank my wonderful and committed program and site resources committees, particularly the co-chairs, Avery Gordon, Rebecca Hill, Grace Hong, and Junaid Rana. I also want to acknowledge the steadfast commitment of our GAs, particularly Molly Benitez. Molly took the utmost care of the program committee's needs and our vision. My appreciation goes to Christine Busick of INMEX, our meeting planning company, Our assistant director, Deborah Kimmy, has taken the ASA into her mind and her heart. We are very lucky to have her with us. Last but not least, Dr. John Stevens, who loves this association most of all, okay? Yes. Most of all. Happy birthday, John. All right, no one is more committed to this organization than John, and who has been yoked to it for 30 years and more. What we have here in this association is, to a large degree, the outcome of John's vision and John's protection. There are not enough thank yous. Yeah. All right, now, as many of you know, I am at home, and the circumstances compel a presidential address that gives you a sense of how this region launched me. So what I have prepared is my version of two of my favorite texts that have traveled with me since my days as a teenager, and that's Zora Neale Hurston's Dust Tracks on a Road, and Eudora Welty's One Writer's Beginning. In our house on 615 Bridge Street in Manchester, Georgia, about an hour and 15 minutes from Atlanta, going south on 85, my brothers and I grew up to the sound of Mama singing. Daddy said that Mama patterned her life after Aretha Franklin. In fact, people came from out of town to hear Mama sing. Like Aretha, Mama created sounds and pictures with her voice. Hills and mountains traveled over, storms that were the settings for toiling and waiting, baptisms in the Jordan River, everybody shouting, nobody doubting, and bells that rang and rang. I learned very early on that Mama's voice was part of the general creativity of the black communities in Manchester and in other black communities that made up Meriwether County. It was my appreciation of the general creativity among these everyday people that made me image, sound, and time-minded as a writer and scholar. It also marked the rural as a site of heterogeneous temporalities and spaces that even the most vaunted intellectual formations have strained to appreciate and acknowledge. In 1870, the black woman intellectual and writer Frances Ellen Watkins Harper wrote in a letter to her friend, the former abolitionist and writer William Still, from Greenville, Georgia, located in west central Georgia. Greenville is in the northern end of Meriwether County, just a 20-minute ride from where I grew up in Manchester, which is located in the southern end of the county. In her letter to Steele, Harper wrote, quote, "Part of my lectures are given privately to women, and for them I never make any charge to take any collection. But this part of the country reminds me of heathen ground. And though my work may not be recognized as part of it, used to be in the North, yet never perhaps were my services more needed. And according to their intelligence and means, perhaps never better appreciated than here among these lowly people," end quote. As it turns out, my county was the beneficiary of Harper's efforts at gender and racial equity. In Greenville, she specifically meant to, quote, "talk with the women about their daughters and about things connected with the welfare of the race," end quote, believing that, quote, "now is the time for our women to begin to try to lift up their heads and plant the roots of progress under the hearthstone," end quote. According to the literary scholar Francis Smith Foster, Harper's travels in the southern states were part of an effort to advance the project of Reconstruction. As Foster argues, quote, "Harper braved the suspicion of Southern blacks who were wary of fast-talking Yankees of any hue and of Southern whites whose methods of dealing with outside agitators were not softened if that agitator happened to be a woman," end quote. While a student at Howard University, I remember reading Harper's letter from Greenville, taking no small amount of pleasure that one of the most popular African-American intellectuals and poets of the 19th century had visited the land where I was raised. But then, as now, my eyes still linger over her description of Greenville as heathen ground. Whatever she meant by the term, its settler colonial resonance is unmistakable, as are the ways in which it others the region's Black rural inhabitants. Indeed, a careful perusal of the canonical works in African American literature reveals that while Black migrants and urbanites may have been the quintessential figures of modernity, Black rural folks were figured as the antithesis of modern progress. Remember, if you will, how Alain Locke defined the new Negro in 1925 by relating this new modern type to the meanings of Black migration. As he stated, quote, "With each successive wave of Negro migration, the movement of the Negro becomes more and more of a mass movement toward the larger and the more democratic chance, in the Negro's case, a deliberate flight not only from countryside to city, but from medieval America to modern," end quote. Thinking back to my years at Howard, I knew that I was supposed to identify with Locke's New Negro, with the verve and momentum of Black progress, but every time I read it, the pitch of the sentence never failed to land on the word medieval. For I was part of that segment of Black people who chose not to become part of the migration north, but who elected to remain part of medieval and heathen ground. The state of Georgia belonged to the Cherokees and the Creeks originally. In the 1700s, groups of Muskogee Creeks settled westward in Columbus, Georgia, and the towns near it. In 1826, the Georgia Assembly passed an act to organize the territory lately acquired from the Creek Indians lying between the Flint and Chattahoochee rivers. The region where I grew up was part of this acquisition. In those days, the Southeast was an ethnically and racially heterogeneous territory made up of whites, natives, and Blacks. Out of this diversity would come a racially mixed population. Describing my part of the world, one historian puts it this way, quote, "The coastal rim of the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, including the Black Muskogee homeland in the Southeast, was that part of the New World where one encountered most Afro-Indians and triracial mixtures," end quote. In the segregated Black neighborhood where I grew up and in the various churches, these mixtures of Blacks and Indians were so common that as a child I thought that Blackness and Indianness were denominations of one another. These were the days when, as the scholar Habiba Ibrahim argues, quote, "Blackness and multiraciality were family, having been made so by the rule of hypodescent, also known as the one-drop rule, which set the parameters of Blackness wide enough to encompass racial mixedness. Back home, and during that time, there were Black people with rounded features and thick hair, and other Blacks with angular features, high cheekbones, golden skin, and hair that they could sit on, as the folks would say." Historians talk about this history of intermixture as both clarifying and confusing, since no term, Black or Native, could achieve any sort of precision where these people and their communities were concerned. My region and family illustrated this point exactly. Both Mama and Daddy's people were the result of intermarriages between African Americans and Muskogee Creek. In fact, on Mama's side of the family, we were brought up on stories of my great-great-grandfather, Grandpa Dan, a Muskogee farmer and root worker who carried a shotgun everywhere he went. One of the earliest stories that I remember is Mama telling me that she slept beside him right after he died while the grown folks made arrangements for his funeral in the other room. "You weren't scared to sleep beside him, Mama?" I asked her. "No, that was my granddaddy." Like many Black Southern families, ours had its own mythology, replete with the pantheon of legendary figures and feats, like Cousin Harold, whom it was told was strong enough as a child to lift up the back end of my grandmother's car. all on account of the mere but not insignificant fact that he was double-jointed. One such legend was Grandpa Dan's daughter and my maternal grandmother, Grandma Eldora, whom I loved dearly. She was famous for her defiance of racial convention. One story had it that she, during the height of segregation, cussed the white grocer, Mr. A.J. Saul, clean out for charging her 5 cents over for a bag of flour. As a child, I realized that my mother's family was made up of great-grandparents who identified as Indian and their children who came to understand themselves as African American. But intermarriage and intermixture did not mean that everybody was on one accord. Living rooms and dens would become the scenes for old racial animosities and hostilities, especially about the black folks out there. In the 18th century, Britain, the leading slave-trading nation, transported large numbers of blacks to the southeast. Often the enslaved would steal away to Creek territory. Fearing alliances between the two groups, British colonizers contracted with neighboring Indians to return the fugitives whole or in pieces. In addition, as the anthropologist William S. Willis argued in a 1963 article in the Journal of Negro History, British colonizers actively sowed enmity and fear among blacks and Indians, enlisting blacks to fight against Indians and conscripting Indians to return slaves to their masters. This project can be heard in the words of James Glenn, the governor of South Carolina, who said in 1758, quote, "It has always been the policy of the government to create an aversion in Indians to Negroes," end quote. A settler colonial rancor would snake its way into articulations of an emergent black modernist and American subjectivity in the 19th century. Consider, for example, what Frederick Douglass said in an address to whites, quote, "We have joined you in America. We are one of you, as opposed to the American Indians who just want to huddle in their blanket and go off to their hills," or what the orator and abolitionist Maria Stewart said in 1832, "Did the pilgrims, when they landed on these shores, quietly compose themselves and say, 'The Britons have all the money and the power, and we must continue their servants forever'? Did they sluggishly sigh to say, 'Our lot is hard, the Indians own the soil, and we cannot cultivate it'? No, they first made powerful efforts to raise themselves, and then God raised up these illustrious patriots, Washington and Lafayette, to assist and defend them," end quote. Among Muskogee Creek elites, that enmity would also be concocted out of the intersections of race and property. In the late 1780s and 1790s, Creek country in Georgia was divided between a slave-owning mestizo elite and non-elite Creeks who adopted fugitives in their clans and bestowed upon them the rights and privileges of clan members. The status of blacks would, according to the historian Claudio Sant, quote, "vary according to the uneven expansion across the land of private property and centralized power," end quote. A mestizo bourgeoisie, typically children of Creek women and British traders, promoted European notions of private property to extend individual control of the land, livestock, and people. By promoting Western notions of private property, this Creek bourgeoisie would disrupt indigenous traditions that distributed power among the various clans and towns. Private property would be a way of centralizing power in leaders understood not as representatives of various towns, but of a Creek nation that would try to approximate a federal government with a centralized executive power to control Indians, particularly around the acquisition, cultivation, and protection of property. Such Creek elites and slave owners as Alexander McGillivray, White Lieutenant, and Alexander Cornels promoted European notions of property, race, and land as a means of fostering relationships with European colonizers. In this regard, McGillivray, Lieutenant, and Cornell's would help to extend a settler colonial discourse honed in 17th century England that, as the legal scholar Brenda Bandar argues, quote, inscribed notions of white European superiority and philosophical concepts of the proper person who possessed the capacity to appropriate, end quote. Indeed, in a moment in which elites such as McGillivray would capture black fugitives and return them to Spanish colonizers in the late 18th century, southeastern parts of the US, racial slavery would be conjoined with settler colonialism. As Sant writes, quote, wealthy creeks along the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers acted as agents of racial segregation. McGillivray and others worked with Spanish authorities to limit the freedom of Africans and their descendants, and by establishing slave plantations, they linked physical appearance with division of labor, end quote. Race and settler colonialism intersected, and my region is the result of that intersection. The history of property illustrates the ways in which European, racial, and colonial ideologies helped to turn land into property and people into chattel. It was the project of white supremacy and capitalist property relations to institutionalize Indianness and blackness as antagonists. I am the issue of that shift that took place in the latter part of the 18th century with attitudes toward race and property, the effort to produce blackness and Indianness as antagonists even in the midst of intermarriage. My maternal family's history is testament that those old antagonisms could persist, ensuring that an 18th century racial project would engrave its image on family relations and identities in the 20th century. My family and this region are thus partly apprehended by black, white, and native bourgeois formations that promoted racial and settler colonial ideologies that themselves linked, as Bandar shows, the material cultivation of the land to the civilizing of a people presumably in need of improvement. As I've written elsewhere, growing up in this region gave me the impression that slavery had the nearness of just a few decades instead of the distance of a bygone century. After all, it was not unusual to hear people use words and phrases from slavery days, parasol for umbrella, or I'll be there directly for I'll see you soon, or make haste for boy, you better get to going. On Daddy's side of the family, we were brought up on stories that Granddaddy Willie Marvin told us about the bush arbor, the lean-tos that members of the family who were slaves made when they wanted to meet and worship. One time, I went to visit our neighbor down the street, Miss Ruby Buchanan, whom the people called Sister Buck. She brought slavery's inhumanity up close for me. She said that in her grandmother's recollection, the church where I was baptized was on the original site of one of the main slave plantations. My grandmama said she remembered seeing people eating from a trough. In the life and times of Frederick Douglass, Douglass described such a scene, writing, quote, we were not regularly allowanced. Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. This was called mush. It was put into a larger tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs, they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, and none with spoons. He that ate fastest got most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied, end quote. Ever since Sister Buck told me that story, I have always marveled at the fact that the same people that a system tried to reduce to swine would elect to rebuild their lives on that very spot, as if they had set their minds and hearts to radically rearticulate the land of their traumas. On that spot, where I was baptized, they built a church and named it Concord. I remember my teenage years during the 1980s as part of a great intellectual adventure, due in no small part to an uncanny confluence of events in the local and national worlds. One Christmas, my paternal Aunt Betty gave me a box filled with books from the Shrine of the Black Madonna on Abernathy Boulevard in Atlanta. To this day, I can still feel my jubilation at finding Arnold Rampersad's The Life of Langston Hughes, Volume 1, Gwendolyn Brooks's Maud Martha, D.H. Melham's Gwendolyn Brooks, Poetry and the Heroic Voice, and selected poems of Langston Hughes, hiding there under crumpled pages of newspaper. After seeing the bookstore's phone number stamped inside the books, I called them and had them send me a catalog. Other books followed soon thereafter. The Negritude Poets, an anthology of translations from the French, edited by Ellen Conroy Kennedy. Joseph Harris's Africans and Their History, Paul Laurence Dunbar's Lyrics of Lowly Life, Toni Morrison's Tar Baby, and Beloved. These books gave me my first sense of what it meant to be a writer. Ever since I could read, I, like so many black children in these parts and from that era, was made to recite poems for this Easter Sunday service, that Sunday school convention, or yet another Christmas program. Recognizing that I had a talent for expression, various churches in the county contacted Mama to have me read at special occasions and events. But before discovering the bookstore, either Mama or I would find suitable but obscure poems that I could read or memorize. But the Shrine of the Black Madonna handed me a literature that I could present as a performer and emulate as a writer. So at times I might read For My People by Margaret Walker Alexander, or Paul Laurence Dunbar's An Antebellum Sermon, Langston Hughes, The Negro Mother, or the scene in the clearing where Baby Suggs, holy, would preach her warm weather sermon. But at other times, I would try my own hand at producing something in the styles of these writers. In those humble churches, I first experimented with literary form. I would imitate Langston Hughes's blues rhythm or Zora Hurston's use of dialect for such occasions. I was very conscious that I was trying to do that thing that Toni Morrison talked about when she said in 1981, quote, "I write what I have recently begun to call village literature. Fiction that is really for the village, for the tribe," end quote. When I started presenting my writing for those churches that had names given to them by former slaves, names that were both assured and ardent, ones like New Hope, Calvary, Rising Star, Friendship, Greater Siloam, Valley Grove, and St. Paul, the proof that I had gotten the writing right in my experimentation was in the fact that after I read, the people would say, "Amen." What you have to understand was that there was no Black history class or curriculum in the county high school, and there was little mention of Black writers in our textbooks. There were no bookstores and only a small regional library that serviced the entire county. So after I would receive a shipment of books from the Shrine and read them, I would pass them on to my friends, and we would begin to produce a curriculum of our own, one made up of Alex Haley's Roots, James Weldon Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, Alice Walker's The Color Purple, Martin Luther King's Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and of course, the autobiography of Malcolm X. Sometimes the adults would follow suit and become part of our after-school curriculum as well. A case in point was Mama's mother and Grandma Eldora's daughter, Grandma Willie Mae. She liked to put her pulp fiction where she could reach them. Dean Kuntz's Demon Seed lay in the vegetable basket among the onions and garlic. William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist sat near the sewing machine. When Black literature came into our lives, Grandma would pick up the books that I had carelessly left around her house and read them, mostly doing so after cooking and cleaning at Dr. and Mrs. Smith, or right after supper, or just before bed. This was the 1980s, the decades in which Black feminist writers like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Angela Davis, Maya Angelou, Ntozake Shange, Michelle Wallace, and others were setting the horizon for intellectual life for the entire nation. Grandma gravitated toward this literature, and after a while, she had read through all of Maya Angelou's autobiographies, Paula Giddings' When and Where I Enter, The Impact of Black Women on Race and Sex in America, Gerda Lerner's Black Women in White America, J. California Cooper's novels, Family, and The Matter is Life, and Paula Marshall's praise song for the widow. In this after-school and after-work curriculum, all of us, Grandma and us kids, would get the book's lessons during those nighttime hours that school and work could not claim. In Proletarian Nights, The Worker's Dream in 19th century France, Jacques Rancière talks about workers who should have been, according to the conventional Marxist discourse, confirmation of capital's totalizing alienation, proof that workers had been reduced to mere cogs. Instead, he found in the French worker archives of the early 1800s accounts of the lingerie maker who wrote of the adventures that she had as a reader, the carpenter who used his leisure hours to build his own personal library, and the typographer's son who taught himself to read but desperately wanted to learn how to write verse. Contrary to the perceptions of French intellectual elites, the workers did not need the mysteries of domination explained to them. They simply wanted, as Rancière put it, quote, to take back the time that was refused them by educating their perceptions and their thought in order to free themselves in the very exercise of everyday work, or by winning from nightly rest the time to discuss, write, compose verses, or develop philosophies, end quote. For Rancière, their emancipation lied in their efforts to, quote, subvert the order of time prescribed by domination, to interrupt its continuities and transform the pauses it imposes into regained freedom, end quote. For us kids, the scene of domination was the high school's determination that there would be no time for the study of Black histories and literatures. For Grandma Willie Mae, the scene of limitation was the order of time imposed upon her as a worker, an order that would make no time for her love of Black women's scholarly and cultural production. And so, we rural folk would work to win from nightly rest some time to recreate ourselves as readers and writers. One day, while making one of her legendary cakes, maybe a caramel, a coconut, a 7-Up, or a red velvet, Grandma, standing at her mixer and imbibing the Black feminist ethos of the era, turned to me and said, Rod, when the Black woman has been married and then knows what it means to be divorced or widowed, she does not wish to know marriage again. In addition to being a decade of intellection, the 80s were also a period of political awakening for others and myself in the county. In the latter part of the decade, there was an intense effort to consolidate Woodbury and Greenville high schools at the northern end of the county with Manchester High School, the one that my friends and I attended, at the southern end. Woodbury and Greenville were the predominantly Black schools, and because of that, received the least resources. Manchester, the predominantly white school, received the bulk of the county's monies. The county NAACP led an effort to consolidate the school system to correct the racial and class disparities borne predominantly by folks at the northern end and to address the racial inequities caused by the tracking system at Manchester High School in the Southern, one in which white kids predominated in the upper level courses and black kids dominated the lower level ones. A dynamic cross-class movement arose among blacks in Manchester, Woodbury, and Greenville. Part of the county NAACP's efforts involved inspiring junior high and high school students to form a junior division of the county NAACP. As a result of this project, young people from all across the county would be mentored by civil rights veterans who during the working hours were our principals, teachers, librarians, and school secretaries, but who in after hours taught us to hold and convene organizing meetings and community forums, and how to conduct door-to-door canvassing on the upcoming school referendum. Churches, multi-purpose centers, and daycares would be filled with people of all ages, each one eager to learn and to become part of a struggle for equal education. In these meetings, many of us got our first real political education, an education that involved approaching political victories, not as one-time events, but as carefully developed journeys. In his 1966 article, Political Commitment, a young Stuart Hall argued, quote, "Politics is not simply about having a mandate. It is about producing the conditions for a mandate. It is about the making of social consciousness, even more so than the accession to political power," end quote. Before my eyes, I watched everyday people like my mama and Grandma Willie Mae make social consciousness among neighbors and church folks as we went door to door trying to raise people's awarenesses about the importance of the upcoming referendum. In retaliation against our movement, racist whites within the county threatened to revive the KKK, and a few of our white teachers even whispered in earshot that black folks in the county were better off during slavery. But those dedicated to the school consolidation movement remained undeterred. There was also a burgeoning sense of internationalism in the 80s and early 90s, one that activated rural terrains as well. The anti-apartheid movement captured the attention of blacks in the region. Conversations in school and at home were often filled with discussions of the ugliness of apartheid, which people encountered through the 1987 film, Cry Freedom, starring Denzel Washington as Stephen Biko, and the Oprah Winfrey Show's episode on the South African writer Mark Matabani's biography, Coffer Boy. Moreover, black folks in the county sat riveted to the television like the rest of the nation when Mandela was released from prison in February of 1990. Our mentors in the county NAACP encouraged those of us in the junior NAACP to find ways to connect our local efforts around school equality to the struggles happening on the continent. Indeed, our mentors in the county arranged a trip so that we could be a part of the 50,000 people who heard Mandela speak at the Georgia Tech Stadium. Just 40 minutes from where I grew up is the School of the Americas in Fort Benning. In her book, The School of the Americas, Military Training, Political Violence, the anthropologist Leslie Gill writes, quote, "The School of the Americas is a U.S. Army center for Latin American militaries that since its establishment in the Panama Canal Zone in 1946 has trained over 60,000 soldiers in combat-related skills and counterinsurgency doctrine," end quote. The school links Georgia and the Southeast to brutal repression in Argentina, Panama, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, a repression that is part of the U.S.'s identity as the largest weapons distributor in the world, a fact that makes the U.S., as Iqbal Ahmad put it, a death merchant that has contributed to the devastation of life in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Palestine. It was only a few years later that I was able to connect the internationalism of black freedom movements to black queer formations, doing so through the 1994 National Black Arts Festival held here in Atlanta. That year's roster included performances by South Africa's Ladysmith Black Mambazo, the Senegalese balladeer Youssou N'Dour, the African-American gay male performance ensemble Pomo Afro Homo, as well as a screening of Camp de Tira by Senegalese director Ousmane Sembène, and performances by other Black queer artists. I can still remember that Friday evening, August the 4th, when I, a young budding Black queer intellectual, watched for free Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Sapphire, Essex Hempfield, Kevin Powell, and Hakeem Adabuti read their poetry. That night, the tensions of two currents within Black radical traditions collided and were embodied on that stage. One represented a Black nationalist investment in normative heterosexual masculinity, and the other a queer and feminist one aimed at its disruption. Somehow, seeing all of them on that stage, filled as it was with brilliance and suspense, clarified my own position about feminism, queerness, and nationalism going forward. This land that was characterized as unmodern, heathen ground, and that was invested with the racial antagonisms necessary for the expansion of property, was in fact the site of some of modernity's most exciting developments. Here is a portrait of the rural as racially heterogeneous and as the location of struggles over heterogeneity. Here is a picture of country people refusing to surrender to the social orders that asked us to fix our gazes and creative powers only on the self-serving ends of dominant institutions. And here is a profile of the land drawing us into greater relation with the world and its possibilities. In this moment of increasing repression along the lines of race, gender, transgender, class, sexuality, indigeneity, and immigration status, the mountains and the hills, the rocks and the rivers, the wild animals and the tame, all beseech us at this hour. Gather the best of your traditions, they say, the foremost of your ancestral medicines, the most life-sustaining dark sayings given to you by loved ones here and gone on. The sky is gray and cloudy, and the storm is coming, but you have everything you need. In responsibilities of the Black scholar to the community, the theologian, historian, and director of Atlanta's Institute of the Black World, Vincent Harding touched on the meaning of land as the site of ancestral powers comprised of overlapping communities and histories. Describing his family's decision to move to Denver, Colorado, he said, quote, "We moved to Denver in part because of the conviction that Black people must assume major responsibility for the re-envisioning and reshaping of this society. I felt intuitively that there were certain powers extant in the Southwest that I needed to be in touch with, among them the power of the natives of this land and the power of the Chicanos. And so part of my reason for going was to find a way to understand more fully and to participate more deeply in the life of Native American and Chicago communities, and to see the ways in which children of Africa could come into deeper relationship with children of Mexico and children of the earth," end quote. Against articulations of the land as heathen and therefore in need of improvement, and against the conscription of the land for capitalist acquisition, Harding cites the land as the location for historical sources and powers, ones put there by all who have crossed and inhabited it. In this way, he touches on a point that Jody Bird, Alyosha Goldstein, Jody Malamed, and Chandan Reddy make in their article, Predatory Value, Economies of Dispossession and Disturbed Relationalities. They write, quote, "If the grounded relationalities of indigenous philosophies might tell us anything, then they remind us that knowledge must always remain grounded as the land calls to us, and for us to find our place within the ongoing acts of interconnectivity that surround us, end quote. Hear this story now. Harding was standing before class at Spelman, doing what he usually did, talking about how, quote, slavery had dehumanized our people. And then he said, quote, that day, something moved me to ask myself, who are these young people before me? These are the great-great-grandchildren of those folks I'm saying were dehumanized. If those folks had truly been dehumanized, then these students wouldn't be here. There wouldn't be anybody out there struggling, washing, scrubbing, stealing, hustling to make sure they were here. There would have been no tradition in the family that said, you got to be there. There would have been no encouragement that said, get out of bed in the morning, you got to go to school. Here, Harding rebuts those discourses, seductive as they are, erudite as they seem, that try to reduce Black life to its social repressions. This determination to meet life with life is a vital ingredient for what Avery Gordon calls being indifference, or as she puts it, quote, a political consciousness and sensuous knowledge for living on better terms than what we're offered, as if you had the necessity and freedom to do so, end quote. The American Studies Association is one site where we have attempted to activate this being indifference and where we can activate it even more. In like spirit, Harding says, quote, I think that part of the responsibility of Black scholars is to help remind themselves and the community that they have constantly moved through darkness to light, constantly moved through pain to healing, end quote. We can go further and read this advice for its wide applicability to all peoples and communities, characterized as they are by a vast reservoir of sources and powers. Engaging those sources and powers is our only chance to use the land in the way that the land intended, as the basis for envisioning and activating what Stuart Hall referred to as, quote, the interrelatedness of issues which is alone able to make the démarche from the existing to society to any other political possibility. Thank you.